What's good in the hood, YouTube? This is Crazy Samurai 71 here, bringing you another video. Today I'm bringing you a video on Power Rangers Hyperforce episode 15. Yeah, we're 15 episodes in now, so we're 60% through Power Rangers Hyperforce, at least the first season. And I'll say this much right now, this episode is probably either my favorite episode or my second favorite episode. Still can't say for sure. I would either say this or episode 12. Those two episodes so far have been so good. This one definitely has to be either one or two. It's so hard to say because it was such an intense episode. There was some great humor, some awesome stuff in this episode. I can't tell you how much I love this episode today. And just in general, today's been a really awesome day for Power Rangers. We just got a whole bunch of guests announced for Power Morphicon, which you should totally go to, and I will see you there if you're going. And, Power Morphicon's great, but we also got Power Rangers Hyperforce today, and that was awesome. And then we also got the confirmation that Power Rangers is going to continue on Nickelodeon, which is nice. Not everyone loves that aspect of it, but it is something to note, of course. Power Rangers Hyperforce today was really great. So many cool moments happened. Humor, you name it, so much fun stuff. So let's get into the actual episode itself because there's a lot to unload and talk about. For starters, this is the return of Yoshi. Yoshi plays Joe in Power Rangers Hyperforce, so he returned again. That's very cool. For those that are wondering, are we going to get an actor to guest star from Power Rangers SPD anymore? Probably not, but they did say during the fireside chat that they still could go back to the same seasons again, but do it at different points in time. So that's perfectly fine. I actually like that idea. They could go back and re-travel to those same seasons, but do it a different way. And they could have different actors. So like if you were hoping for someone in Mighty Morphin to show up that didn't show up, there's still a chance that they could show up in Mighty Morphin. And if you were hoping for someone to show up in, I don't know, RPM that didn't show up, that could still happen. Any of these seasons that they've already visited, they could go back to. Same with Mystic Force, SBD, possibility. It's just a matter of, does it fit the story? And that's something that they constantly address during the fireside chat today. It's not a matter of, do they not want to or do they want to? It's a matter of, does it fit the story? If it fits the story, more power to you. It's going to happen. And the way that the episode kind of ends even gives you that kind of clue that it could happen. So let's get into the actual episode. I know I'm giving you all this other detail, and it's nice, but let's actually get into the episode itself. The episode starts off with us seeing, obviously, the Rangers are in the SBD era of Power Rangers. They're in the mutant hideout, where we see Napoleon Wretch, the frog mutant leader of these mutants, and we end up seeing Maxwell, which Maxwell is actually Joe, and he's appointed as the guard for Napoleon. And what happens is that Napoleon Wretch has this proton accelerator, which he wants to use to create the absorption. Now, the absorption is still unclear even towards the end of the episode. It's kind of like you have to interpret things, but it is something to note. So, actually, now that I think about it, it makes a lot of sense. It's just that they don't state what it is, but it makes sense in a way because of what happens towards the end. Now that I think about it, yeah, I just realized what the absorption was. Okay, yeah, pretty bad stuff. Okay, we'll get into that. So anyway, moving on from here, what we end up seeing is that the Rangers see all this going on. They're in different locations within this group of people that are cheering, well, mainly mutants, but they're all cheering, seeing Joe, as the guard and being appointed to this position. Everyone's cheering for Maxwell. Vesper even gets really close, and eventually Joe ends up talking to one of the scarier figures, which is the mutant known as Jackson. Jackson is this monster with this crab arm, and he is pretty interesting. He's a tougher mutant, and he is told to investigate some of the people in the area for some technology that they may have from the future or whatever. So that's interesting. So what does end up happening from here is that Eddie tries to head over towards where Vesper is. We also have this moment with Detective Song contacting a backup, basically saying that we'll have backup on standby in case this doesn't work out very well, because Eddie ends up communicating with Detective Song, and that's important, of course. what we do end up seeing also is that Jackson does see Vesper and Eddie, because at one point they end up dancing and we're doing all these weird moves, and Jackson does notice them. So then from there, Vesper and Eddie get closer to Joe, and we end up seeing some interesting stuff. There's this moment with Marvin Jack trying to divert the mutants towards the back entrance so that they don't end up actually, hurting any of the mutants or leading to less fights happening or casualties, which is important. So that all happens. We also see Jackson go back on stage and talk to Napoleon, which Napoleon is informed that there is futuristic technology in the area and they want to get rid of whoever it is that has it. So that leads to the Rangers having to really be concerned with their current state of being, because there's so many mutants and these mutants are vicious and dangerous and they could hurt the Rangers really badly. So what does end up happening eventually is that Jack suggests the idea of using ice cream to actually, create a diversion. So that all happens. Eventually, what does end up happening from here is that Napoleon and Joe end up hiding down in the lower location of the hideout that they're in, and they go with the proton accelerator. And what ends up happening is that it's pretty interesting story-wise. Joe appears by Jackson, and Jackson is told to go towards some random people to check for technology. Jack tries to blend in by using his clothing in a certain way to kind of create the illusion that he's a mutant or something like that. It's interesting. We also have this moment where where the mutant Jackson tries to search Chloe, and Chloe's still wearing her battleizer, and she has the trench coat on. And what happens is that Jackson tries to grab her, and she basically removes the trench coat, runs with her battleizer, and then tons of mutants go after her and try to attack her, which is interesting, of course. And that's a pretty crazy moment. Let's just say that much right now. Pretty wild. So, what does end up happening is that, Joe... Well, actually, I'm trying to see here. What was it again? Several monsters try to stop Chloe when she's wearing her battleizer. Chloe manages to defend herself pretty well for a good while. Several guys go after Chloe at different points. Chloe even tries to use her hurricane whirlwind to knock some of the mutants away. And, things continue to escalate. Joe and Napoleon head near the proton accelerator towards the bottom, and there is Carl, who is this other mutant. And Carl was the character that called Eddie Johnny. Now, it's really weird how they kind of explain that whole situation, but yes, Carl is the same character that called Eddie Johnny in the previous episode. Carl informs Napoleon that there is a ranger in the building later on, and that leads to Napoleon wanting to stay in place while Joe goes to deal with the ranger, but Joe decides not to, because he's trying to distract them. It's clear that Joe isn't really clear as to what his position is. Is he an enemy? Is he a good guy? What's his position, of course? So what does end up happening is that Joe eventually does convince Napoleon to stay in place. Jack is the only ranger that actually sees Joe leave, so that's important. And Marv tries to help push the mutants out of the building. So this is all happening. Eventually, Joe goes after the Rangers, and Napoleon is told to go with Carl. And Joe ends up actually heading to a different location where he tries to avoid some attacks, and also goes to the teleporter room and tries to get to the proton accelerator. And while Napoleon and Carl are elsewhere. So that's all happening. What we also see is, let me see here. Joe sneaks behind Napoleon and Carl, tries to get into different positions. Chloe gets surrounded by different monsters, which is crazy. Vesper even uses holograms to create the illusion of her being a mutant, and then she tries to be this weird damsel in distress that needs help finding her purse and her lost little dog, and basically she becomes a pop star that everyone's attracted to and wants to help out, which is interesting, and that's something that definitely leads to another distraction occurring. We also have this moment where Eddie ends up trying to save Chloe, where he actually jumps in front of Chloe when there is this mutant that tries to throw a barrel that supposedly has some explosives in it. And Eddie ends up morphing, and the blast of the barrel actually hurts Chloe pretty badly. So, that's not great. Of course, that's all happening, and eventually Chloe and Eddie try to run out of the building and try to contact Detective Song, and Eddie says that the backup is on standby, and what ends up happening is that Jack contacts Chloe and tries to help her, and Jack and Chloe rush out of the building with Eddie. So those three are going out of the building. The ones that are left though are still Marv and Vesper. Marv, we don't hear as much during this scene. He is involved in a couple of other situations where he tries to create commotion about certain situations, and also trying to push enemies out of the building. What else is there? Eventually, when Eddie and Chloe get out of the building, what does end up happening is that Chloe uses a hurricane whirlwind, and Eddie uses his Oceanus Triton to try to actually spread water and blast the mutants back into the building and drench them and completely soak them. So that's something. Yes, so all this is happening. Napoleon eventually does appear where the proton accelerator is and sees that Joe's there working on it, and basically tries to say, we have to get going. We have to escape now, even though in reality Napoleon doesn't want to be seen as weak. That's something that's kind of important, that's brought up a number of times. So all that happens. Napoleon even tries to use his tongue to wrap around Joe and threaten him. Carl is told to round up other mutants for the absorption that night. So all this is happening. People in water eventually escape with, we have Marv and Vesper escape eventually after she's put into a weird position where she has to deal with these monsters that are attracted to her. And Marv basically pretends to be Vesper's brother and gets her out of the building. So the Rangers all return back to Detective Song's vehicle, and the backup is still there and is trying to protect everyone, and they eventually return back to the SPD headquarters, which is where things get really interesting really fast. And let's just say this much right now, it's probably the best part of this episode is the interrogation scene that happens from here, because following this, what ends up happening is that the Rangers have to go back to the base. They're all restrained and forced into individual cells where they have to speak and confess the truth. So each of them has different confessions, and how they confess very different from one to another. And I'll tell you this much right now, it's one of the best things the show has had so far. The interrogation scenes are just so great to watch. So if you're hoping for something really fun to watch, when this episode releases on YouTube, believe me, you're not gonna want to miss this one, because this one has some really awesome stuff. So what does end up happening is that Zach does return as Doggy Kruger. For starters, we end up seeing Chloe being questioned, which is interesting. Chloe is asked several times to de-transform because she's still in her battleizer form, but she doesn't want to listen because, they don't trust the SPD Rangers. They don't feel like what they did was right, and they never were being given the proper treatment and everything. And, she jokes around about what planet they were from, and apparently there was no SPD on Planet Cayenne. Planet Cayenne does exist in that time, but there's no SPD there, so clearly they're lying. So that's all happening. We also end up hearing about the technology the Rangers have are not from the database that they know of. So whatever it is, it's futuristic or it's just something unusual to them. So what does end up happening also is that eventually Chloe does confess that she is from the future, from the year 3017. But the thing is that Doggy, Kruger, and Song don't believe her. They think that she's crazy. They think that she's lying, and eventually they end up moving on to the next person, which is probably one of the better parts of the interrogation, which is Vespers. Vespers was really good because she starts off by howling at Doggy, and that is hysterical because, he's a dog and he hates the dog puns and all that, and there are so many dog puns that were brought up. Just in general, her part was also really, really savage and vicious because, she brought up points about how, I may be sweet and happy-go-lucky usually, but you know what? I can bring out the teeth and come at you because, she's not afraid to mess around, and she was vicious. I mean, savage and vicious this episode, and I just didn't even know what to say. I mean, holy moly. Just how she acted during this episode was ridiculous. So crazy. And I loved it. Because it showed how far her character could go. Because she's usually pretty much a character that just spills the beans on everything, but spills the beans in a way where it's kind of funny. In this case, she was just sort of you don't mess with me. Wow, that is just, it's not like her, but it's like her in a way, because she acts weird at times, and she does things like this where it's not how she typically acts, but at the same time, there are moments where she'll act like she typically does, where she's just a little bit more outspoken in certain ways. So I just love that moment. Vesper mentions the idea of having dogs on their planet, and Vesper tells Doggy and Song that the Rangers are from the future, and Song and Doggy still don't believe her, and she does transform, so that's important. We then end up seeing Napoleon, Joe, and Carl with the remaining mutants heading towards the island of trash. Joe tries to reconfigure the proton accelerator, which he continues to work on, and that works fine. Then Vesper is not trusted since she is a machine, and they think that she's a machine, so why would we trust her? And then they move on to Eddie, which is another one of those oh my god, crazy moments, which was with Eddie's interrogation. Because literally, what he did, and I know I'm saying literally whatever, but, pretty much what he ended up doing is, he just confesses everything, and he doesn't confess things at a slow pace. He basically says everything, but at a crazy, crazy fast pace. And that's just insane. I mean, everyone was cracking up laughing because of how amazing he was at what he was doing. I mean, he basically nailed it. He went over every character, what's going on, what's the story with the plot and everything else, and he was just going 1,000 miles per hour saying everything. And I just, oh my god, I didn't even know what to say. It was so good. It was so exciting to see that, because I know that Andre has been able to do that kind of stuff in the past where he can go really, really fast and say things, whether it be a song or something else, and he just totally did that, and it was insane, and I loved it. And he had several moments where he was confessing different things about the Rangers, their origins, what their mission is, why they're here, all that kind of stuff. He basically unveiled the whole truth behind them, but at the same time, certain things were a little bit harder to catch because of how fast he was going. So that is all brought up. Eddie was curious about whether or not Vesper talked about him, and Vesper did not, which upset Eddie. And, because he has feelings for her. That is all brought up. They also mentioned the fact that, Eddie continues to talk, and he keeps on trying to say that he's not going to talk, but he does. And there's just several moments where, he'll unveil something, and then he'll realize later on that he's doing that, and he shouldn't be doing that. And that's really interesting. They also talk about the Time Force officers and how that whole thing works with the SPD Rangers, which is cool. Then they learn about... Then what happens is that we end up seeing Vesper continue to howl and get Kruger annoyed, and basically Kruger mentions the idea that Eddie was sad that Vesper didn't talk about Eddie, and that was something that was brought up. So then we come to Jack. Jack was great because he was just this, very straight character who wasn't going to say anything. He really was, quiet, just kind of didn't want to spill anything because, he's an officer of the law, so he knows, he can't be broken. He's just that kind of a guy. So then we come eventually to, then we come back to Joe on the barge, fiddling with the proton accelerator again. Carl walks from behind and asks about how he could get to a higher position because, he sees how successful Joe is in his current position. He needs money because he's not doing very well. He's poor. He lives off the streets and everything like that, and he wants the connections. But at the same time, Joe says, this whole situation, everything that will happen from here will change everything. Whatever occurs with this beacon and the proton accelerator will be a huge transformation of everything that will happen for the future. And what does end up happening is that, Carl is told to stay away by Joe, and eventually Napoleon does show up and he notices that Joe was messing with the proton accelerator and gets pretty annoyed. So Joe lies about the beacon, about making it stronger, and Napoleon inspects the proton accelerator and sees that it has been altered. Now Napoleon grabs Joe in his tongue and attacks him. There's several different attacks that occur. He even tries to convince Napoleon that he's doing the right thing and that he shouldn't, worry. And, just things just continue to get worse and worse. Carl even is told eventually to take the proton accelerator and prepare it so that they can use it later. So then from there, what does end up happening is that we end up seeing Marv's interrogation. Now, Marv's interrogation is another one that's actually pretty interesting. He's basically, he's not he's a butt. He's not a good guy in this situation. He's very much so a jerk or a terrible person that just tries to cause a lot of trouble and not, play along with what's going on. Regarding the interrogation, everything that he was saying, he was basically throwing it back at them and, just being rude. Now, at the same time, the way that he was doing it was not bad. Like, he was trying to, defend his team and do things so that, his team was not seen poorly. But at the same time, he was being kind of rough and a little bit more nasty. And it was kind of similar to how he acted when he was on the Alliance ship in episode 12 in a way, where he kind of just threw things back at the Alliance leader. So that is interesting to see, how he acts in certain situations. So that all does happen. He also wants an apology. Kruger tries different things to really make him talk, but, it just doesn't work out. So eventually we end up having Joe again, and Joe is, captured in the tongue of Napoleon, and Napoleon has thrown these pus-filled warts at Joe, which is disgusting, but it makes sense. Joe tries to teleport, but it doesn't work, and Joe is actually thrown pretty hard. So he's actually put into a pretty terrible state where he's pretty badly injured. Now, Napoleon does fix the proton accelerator. Joe tries to morph, and he does, which is cool, and he basically confirms that he was never on their side. He was just doing this because it was a mission, and he was trying to stop Napoleon from causing trouble. That's why he was messing with the machine. He never was evil. He never was. He was just, posing a certain way rather than being a villain. So that all does happen. We end up seeing Joe fight Napoleon. Joe tries to do different sword attacks, and then eventually Joe is captured again and gets injured pretty badly. So this all happens. Joe tries, multi-attacks, different moves, and eventually Napoleon manages to get the proton accelerator to become operational and open up like a pointy flower and spread its petals, and at that point release a beacon. This beacon signals the Alliance ship to appear, which is pretty crazy. Now what this leads to is the Alliance ship appearing, and it eventually lands, and the mutants are all cheerful and excited because they see all this, and it turns out that the Alliance leader is going to use their energy. And the whole idea of the absorption, basically what that means is that it's absorbing their dark energy and making them into a state where they're not dead, but they're pretty badly weakened. to the point where they're like unconscious. So yeah, pretty devastating effects. Joe has to kind of play along and mess with the Alliance leader and create problems, which is interesting. The Rangers ask for replenishing health because eventually there's these white lights and blast of energy, and their cells shake and all sorts of things happen because the Alliance ship decides to, blast this white beam of energy that really does a lot of damage and creates a huge effect on the nearby cities in New Tech City and all that. And what happens is that eventually, what does end up happening is that the Rangers are told by Song to go with her and deal with the problem, and they're going to go and do that. So they head through the town. The town is in a pretty terrible state, and what we end up seeing is that Vesper's riding shotgun, and there's conversations that are occurring there. Joe, again, pretty badly injured. He does try to teleport a number of times. He has to deal with different enemies. The Alliance leader, again, is still cloaked, so we still don't know what he looks like in full. That's the one thing we still don't have a full grasp of. The Rangers try to get closer and closer. When it comes to the island, they actually have to use their Zords. The only one that can't use their Zord is Marv, which is interesting. So, he has to ride with Chloe. Eventually, when they reach the island, we end up seeing that, Joe tries to put a tracker on the Alliance ship on the top of it, but at one point Joe also gets captured by the Alliance leader. And the thing is that Scorpina eventually calls out saying that, we'll be able to repair the ship now that we've gotten things secured with this beacon and the proton accelerator. Because that's the thing. The proton accelerator ends up being used and for the purposes of powering the ship. And the thing is that when the ship gets powered, it ends up restarting the ship, which leads to them having to get a Time Force badge or something like that to activate it so that it starts back up. So who do they go to? Well, Joe. So that's why Alliance leader holds him and tries to get to the to Joe's morpher so that he can access it. So that's all happening. The Rangers do summon their Zords. They travel across the seas, and we end up seeing that several different situations occur. We have, each of the Rangers using their Zords in different ways. One of the big ones was Jack, who had his Zord in the water, and he actually shoots missiles and launches himself out of the sea. Now that's something to note. We also have this great moment with Eddie, where Eddie wants to heal up Joe because Joe's pretty badly injured, and he does his healing charge. But the thing is that when he tries to talk to when Eddie tries to talk to Joe, what happens is that the Alliance leader hears all of it. So basically, it creates a problem where the Alliance leader knows what's going on, and he really puts things into perspective for the Alliance leader. Now that is really interesting, of course. What we do end up seeing eventually is that the Rangers do try to deal with the Alliance leader in several different situations. They do different attacks. Marv tries to help his brother, and Vesper tries to do a special attack. Jack does an attack with missiles, which does end up leading to Joe being able to get freed, but at the same time, the Alliance leader does eventually get Joe's morpher, so that's important. So eventually Joe loses his morpher. The Rangers then have to go after the Alliance ship because the Alliance ship eventually does end up retreating, and they do another blast of energy which sends all the mutants in the area, which decide to actually go towards Vesper's Zord, because what happens is that they realize that they need to retreat. They end up being put in a state of unconsciousness again. So the blast does hit them. Vesper does try to protect them, but it doesn't work out very well. So that is something to note. Eventually, we end up seeing Carl is in a state of weakness, and they end up actually reviving Carl, which is good to see. And what ends up happening from here is that Okay, sorry about that. Is that basically the Rangers decide to get into their ships after reviving Carl and saying goodbyes, and Detective Song says that she will keep an eye on the mutants and make sure that they're safe. Eddie even gives the mutants money. All that happens. It's a pretty interesting moment. The Rangers do retreat, and the episode ends there as the Rangers head into whatever time period they'll be heading to next. So I'd love to know your guys' opinions. I personally thought this episode, again, was one of the best episodes so far. I know this video was long. A lot of stuff happened in it, which is why I wanted to go over a lot of it. Again, next week will be interesting to see because most likely a new time period, or they'll still be on the ship. They could be traveling through hyperspace or through the time stream still. That is a possibility. We've seen it several times. They may decide episode 17 will be when they travel to another time period. We'll have to wait and see though. So please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you guys think. I'll see you guys in the next video. So until then guys, I'm Crazy Samurai 71, and goodbye guys.